Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Nicole Boggins, Research Assistant Professor in Biomedical Science in the FAU College of Medicine. I'm also the Director of Community Engagement and Programming for the FAU Brain Institute. Today we're very excited to continue our Brainy Days community lecture series with our guest, Dr. Jill Tarter, and also hear from FAU faculty members, Drs. Elan, Barenholtz, and Susan Schneider. Thank you all very much for joining us today for your discussion on brains, minds, and aliens, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and its relevance to brain science. This is the second community event in our Brainy Days series, which is a month-long celebration of neuroscience held annually in March, when we hold events for both scientists and the community. The next segment of the Brainy Days program is called New Insights into Mechanisms and Treatments for Alzheimer's Disease, with Dr. Alan Levy, who is an MD PhD from Emory University. This will also be online, and it will be live from 1 to 2:15 p.m. on March 9th. So we hope you can join us for that as well. I have just a quick note for all of our attendees. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation. Please type your questions in the Q&A button found on the bottom of your screen. It's next to the raise your hand button, but just please write your questions in the Q&A button because the chat button has been disabled. We will take these questions at the end of all of the talks. So I'm going to turn now this over to Dr. Randy Blakely. He is a full professor also in the FAU College of Medicine. He's also the executive director of the FAU Brain Institute pillar. Thank you very much, Dr. Blakely.
Thank you, Nicole. Well, it's a really pleasure to be here this evening and to welcome you as well. We've got an exciting program for you. The FAU Brain Institute is a major investment by Florida Atlantic University as well as the state of Florida in brain sciences. And as executive director, it's my responsibility to recruit the brightest faculty and thought leaders that I can to help build a new infrastructure for brain research, which is exemplified by our new 58,000 square foot facility that will open in March of 2022 on our Jupiter, Florida campus, as well as to communicate what we do to the public. And for the last 4 years, we've run our Brainy Days series. Dr. Boggins has run our Brainy Days series. And it's been a wonderful opportunity for us to get to know you. And I hope that next year you will join us on campus and at some of our other venues to do this in person. For the last 4 years, we've been sponsored generously by Palm Health Foundation. Palm Health Foundation is sponsoring a number of our events and throughout the year, as well as being our lead sponsor for Brainy Days. And I'd like to ask the president and CEO of Palm Health Foundation, Pat McNamara, to tell you a little bit about that foundation. Pat?
Good evening, folks, and we are proud to once again sponsor Brainy Days for 2021. We have been fortunate in our partnership with Dr. Blakely and the FAU Brain Institute in bringing many exciting offerings to Palm Beach County. And we started our brain health initiative 4 years ago in recognition of the promise that the FAU Brain Institute, along with our partners at Scripps and Max Planck and the various others in the community have brought some of the best neuroscientists in the world to our backyard. And so we saw that we have the opportunity to put Palm Beach County on the map for advancing brain health. And this is just one of those many offerings. So thank you for attending.
Great. Thank you, Pat. I wanted to also mention just a couple of other sponsors who helped us put on our programs and build our programs. We're also co-sponsored by the South Florida Science Center and Aquarium, Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in Jupiter, Florida, and the Dana Foundation. Now, I mentioned that one of my responsibilities is to recruit outstanding faculty and build a critical mass, which we are very quickly doing here on our campus in many areas of neuroscience. And one of my true delights has been our most recent recruit, and that's Dr. Susan Schneider. Susan joined us just this past summer in the middle of the COVID epidemic, of course. And she holds the, Susan, you want to join us? There you are. Nope, there you are. Okay, great.
Hello?
Hi. So Susan is the William F. Dietrich Professor in Philosophy of Mind in the College of Arts and Letters at Florida Atlantic University. She is a world-leading expert and highly prolific author, and you may have seen her recent book, Artificial You. If not, check it out. Susan is particularly enthralled by issues that relate to how artificial intelligence of all kinds, go about their business. And she's helped us put together an exciting program tonight. And I won't tell you anything more about it because Susan can do a much better job herself. So I'm turning it over now to you, Susan.
Thank you, Randy. And I am so excited to be here tonight and to be hosting some really wonderful speakers. So tonight we're going to be thinking about the nature of alien minds. That's right. That doesn't mean aliens exist, but we'll be talking about possible minds. And we're going to begin with a discussion about the history of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And let me now introduce Dr. Jill Tarter. She's an American astronomer who is best known for her work on the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or what is called SETI. She is the former director of the Center for SETI Research, holding the Emeritus Chair for SETI Research at the SETI Institute. Discover magazine recently recognized Dr. Tarter as one of the 50 most important women in science. And I'm also very excited to say that she was the inspiration for the main character in my favorite film, which is Contact. And I'm really just so delighted to have you here tonight, Jill. So let's go ahead and get started. And remember to put your questions in the Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Pat, Susan, for that introduction. And I have to start with a confession. I really feel like I'm an imposter here tonight, because although I've been working for decades on this question of searching for extraterrestrial intelligence, I have to admit that the search is actually not for intelligence, because we don't know how to find intelligence. We don't know how to define intelligence. We don't know how we should look for it. So indeed, what we do is we look for some evidence of someone else's technology. And if we find that technology, then we're going to infer that at some point there were some intelligent technologists that created it. So with that confession out of the way, let me start by talking to you about, in fact, what we do at SETI. So it started about the modern era of SETI started in 1959 with this publication of a paper in Nature by Giuseppe Cacconi and Philip Morrison, who said, you know, we have this new technology called radio astronomy, and we could use those telescopes to try and find evidence of someone who's sending a signal, right? And so the last sentence of that paper said the probability of success in this endeavor is difficult to estimate. But if we never search, the chances of success is zero. And that's our philosophy. We're not going to find it unless we go looking. And that's what we've been doing. So following that initial paper, there was a search called Project Ozma by Frank Drake at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, followed by something called OZPA. And the former Soviet Union dominated observing programs through the 70s. Then something called the Cyclops report was published, which was an engineering design study that was done by NASA and Stanford saying how, if we wanted to do this, could we do it? And they came up with a design that was to build 1,600 100-meter telescopes to do this project. And the budget was 20 billion or 30 billion or something absolutely scary. So indeed, we got started on a much smaller level. I worked on Project Serendip at Berkeley because I knew how to program an old computer, a PDP-8S that was given as surplus to Stu Boyer. We did that at Hack Creek, and then NASA got involved, started holding workshops, published a report called NASA SP 419, and then it actually started to do SETI work. We started with using for us at the time, fast tape recorders and ping-ponging between two tape recorders. For 3 minutes, we'd record signals from a target star, and then the next 3 minutes, we'd record signals that was pointed away from the star. And we came back to NASA Ames and reduced those tapes laboriously. Then Senator Proxmire got into the mix and gave SETI one of his Golden Fleece Awards. We lost funding for a year. And then in 1984, we decided to incorporate the SETI Institute as a nonprofit, and actually as a way to save NASA money. Tom Pearson was the first CEO. And so this was the first signal detector that the NASA project built. It was tested out at Goldstone and the DSS-13 down in Southern California, NASA's field station. And it had 64,000 channels. We had a little bit of extra CPU, which was good because that helped to catch the mice that were constantly eating through our cables. And in October of 1992, the 500th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of the New World, we actually launched the NASA SETI program, whose names got changed a number of times to try and hide the finances from the congressional budget hawks. And we began what we call the High Resolution Microwave Survey simultaneously at the Arecibo telescope that you can see there, and in Goldstone, the Deep Space Network. We had a big party because that's what you do when you launch something after all these years. And then we had a year after we started, Senator Bryan from Nevada terminated the SETI program in NASA's budget. And he did it in a way so that we didn't just lose 1 year of funding, but he made it very clear to NASA that if they came back with this item in their budget in the future, they would suffer. So we got terminated, and then we had to figure out how to keep going. And we started something that we called Project Phoenix, rising from the ashes of congressional termination. And you can see that on the right, when the project was terminated, it was indeed in pieces because we had brought it back from a field test and were upgrading it. So that was a pretty bad weekend. I told my husband not to leave me alone with any sharp objects. And then one of my colleagues called and said, you know, if what we were doing on Friday made sense, it's going to make sense on Monday. And we showed up at the SETI Institute and went to the library and took out all of their how-to fundraise books, came back, and everybody sat around the conference table reading only the last chapter of each book, which is how to make the big ask, because we didn't have time to do the standard cultivation and fundraising that many nonprofits do. And our early investors, we were very fortunate. Barney Oliver, who had run Hewlett-Packard Labs for 2 decades, was a larger than life figure, and he was one of our big champions. And everybody in the Silicon Valley owed him a favor. So he took us around and he introduced us to Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard and Gordon Moore and Paul Allen. And these gentlemen came in as our sponsors, and we were quickly able to raise enough money so that by the beginning of the next year, we could go back out in the field and begin the observations for Project Phoenix, which started with 2 telescopes in Australia. This is another hobby horse of mine. 1 telescope is never enough because you have to have a way of discriminating against our own technologies. So Parkes, 64-meter telescope in New South Wales, and MOPRA, a smaller telescope on the other side of the, out into the bush. So we did observations there for 6 months running those telescopes. Then we brought our equipment back, refurbished it, sent it off to the National Radio Astronomy Observatory in Greenbank, West Virginia, and got the students at Georgia Tech to refurbish an old AT&T downlink antenna to turn it into a radio telescope. And we observed with those 2 telescopes for a number of years. And in the process, we refurbished the signal processing equipment that we had been building and went from a full custom system to a system that was based on commercial digital signal processing computers. We moved our equipment to the Arecibo Observatory, and our second telescope was all the way over in the United Kingdom in England. And we observed there until 2004 with new back-end hardware accelerators that we built. So that was Project Phoenix. And the coin of our realm is the number of targets that you look at times the amount of bandwidth that you can observe with your observing program. And so those are the benchmarks for those 3 observing programs. At the end of the 20th century, we began to hold some workshops to say, gee, what should we be doing for the next 20 years? So this was really revisiting that old Cyclops report. It had been a long time, been 3 decades, and did the conclusions still stand up? And we decided that yes, microwave searches were still a good idea. But it made sense to build our own telescope so that we could be on the air 24/7, and that optical SETI, looking at the optical part of the spectrum, was also a good idea. And then lastly, because some signals could be transient, we wanted to be able to look at all the sky all the time in order to be sensitive to transient signals. And we published the results of those workshops in a big tome called SETI 2020. So we then took stock when SETI turned 50 years old. So that would have been in 2010. We said to ourselves, well, how much searching have we actually done? And how much are we planning on doing with the new pieces of SETI 2020? And it's very hard to explain to a public audience how vast this search actually is, right? And so I said, all right, there are 9 dimensions that we have to search through, a cosmic haystack looking for a needle. And I'm going to figure out how broad each of those dimensions are, how much searching we have to do in terms of space and time and frequencies and polarizations and modulation and sensitivity. And then I'm going to take that 9-dimensional volume that I've just calculated, and I'm going to set it equal to the volume of all the Earth's oceans. All right. So how much of the ocean have we searched? Well, at age 50, SETI had actually searched through 1 glass of water, a part in 10 to the 23 out of those oceans. And today, 10 years on, it's more like a small pool, swimming pool, but still not a lot of the ocean. There's still a lot to go. And so we are continuing this search because we understand how much more there is to explore. And we have built, for example, in Northern California, we built our own telescope called the Elan Telescope Array because Paul Allen was a large benefactor. And this telescope is as much about silicon as it is about steel and aluminum, because we couldn't ever have built this large number of small dish array until we had the computing power to bring together the signals from all of those telescopes. And so that interferometer worked for SETI 12 hours a day, every day. We wanted to build 350 of these dishes, but we ran out of money, so we had to stop at some other number, and it was 42. It's a proof of concept that you can, in fact, build a large array, a large telescope as a large number of small dishes, and that is the way new radio telescopes will be built. And so we've been using that telescope, and the thing that this array allows you to do, if you use small dishes, right, you get a large field of view. You can see a large piece of the sky. If you use a lot of small dishes, then you get a lot of sensitivity. So 1/2 degree is the field of view set by a 6-meter telescope working at about 1 gigahertz, 1400 megahertz. And if you can look, you see the Arecibo field of view in that little circle on the lower left-hand side. And Arecibo wanted more, to be able to see more of the sky at the time, so it built a 7-element focal plane array. But here's the field of view for the Elan telescope array, 2.5 degrees, right? And so you can see how much more of the sky you cover at any one time. And you can imagine it's like making a radio picture with about 1250 pixels. And the size of the pixel is determined by how far apart the 2 most extreme antennas in your array are. And so we've made a wide area radio camera for the first time. And it's also possible to do snapshots of individual small pixels, 3 at a time, is what we did with this telescope. And this is the first time that had ever been done. So there's also one more trick you can do with all of these telescopes, is that you can null. You can put a filter on the sky and blank out any signals coming from that direction, which is very useful to do when, in fact, you're trying to avoid emissions from orbiting satellites or overflying airplanes. And so we conducted a number of searches starting in 2007, where our target catalog was composed of stars that we thought would be good hosts for planetary systems. Now remember, this is 2007. The Kepler spacecraft had not yet returned its first list of known exoplanets. So we just had to guess which stars might be good hosts. And then once Kepler returned its first catalog of known exoplanets in 2011, we began looking at those stars. And then once the statistics from the Kepler spacecraft convinced us that in fact, exoplanets are extremely abundant. There are more planets out there in our galaxy than there are stars. Then we went to another strategy, and we began observing the closest stars to our sun moving out in distance. And when you pick the closest stars, you're picking the most abundant type of star, which turns out to be a little red dwarf. So then our catalog became 20,000 red dwarf stars that we wanted to search through. And we continued that activity until a couple of years ago, when indeed we began refurbishing the wideband and sensitive feeds that we had built for the first generation of telescopes. And you can see all those red dots are an astronomer's view of the sky in two coordinates called right ascension and declination. And we'd like to cover in all of those coordinates. But you can see that there are two areas that look a little different, and that's because the Kepler field, which we studied for so long, meant that we were only, when Kepler was above the horizon, at the right declination, we were only looking at the right ascension coordinates that corresponded to the Kepler field of view, which was 100 square degrees. And they were targeting 170,000 stars in that 100 square degrees, looking for planets that would pass in front of their star and dim the light from the star periodically. And that was how we detected exoplanets. And then the other blank space you can see turns out to be where in the sky the geosynchronous belt of satellites that we use for our own communications purposes exist. And you don't want to look in that direction with a very sensitive radio telescope because it will just blast your equipment. It is so strong a signal compared to the signals that we are looking for from very distant astronomical targets. So we avoid the geosynchronous belt. All right, so in 2015, a new game came into town when Yuri Milner, yet another very philanthropic billionaire, dedicated $100 million over 10 years to conduct a search using instrumentation that would be built by the Breakthrough Listen team at UC Berkeley. They didn't build any telescopes, but what they do is build spectacular, fast signal processors, backends, and large memory storage devices. So they've put those telescopes on the Green Bank telescope in West Virginia, on the Parkes telescope in New South Wales, on the optical planet finding telescope at Lick Observatory, and they are currently working on building the back-end signal processing for the Large Fast Telescope in China, for the Meerkat Array in South Africa, and for the Jodrell Bank Telescope and the Merlin Array in the United Kingdom. Okay, my slides, there we go. And fortunately, for a long time, a project called SETI at Home, which would use the unused cycles in your home computer, ran on the Arecibo telescope. And when you weren't using up all your cycles, it ran in the background of your computer and did the same sort of signal processing that we were doing in real time with Project Phoenix. Now, sadly, Arecibo is no more. It collapsed spectacularly, and fortunately no one was injured a few months ago. And whether and how that telescope will be rebuilt in the future is being discussed by the science community today. But there are low frequencies arrays in Holland and across Europe and the United Kingdom that have been used to find low frequency transmittance. There's a small group in Italy, SETI Italia, that's using this telescope at Medicina. There's a sky survey program that's being done by students at the Gabbard Goldstone Apple Valley Radio Telescope. NASA took one of their Deep Space Network telescopes, moved it outside the fence, and the local community built a science education teaching center based around that telescope. And today the students are performing a sky survey as we had once hoped to do with NASA's. And then there are routine observational campaigns putting together all kinds of different telescopes organized out of Japan and something called Project Dorothy. In optical SETI, this is a telescope built by the graduate students at Harvard, which has scanned the 80% of the sky that is visible from Harvard, Massachusetts. looking for bright optical flashes. All of the data that has been taken at the two fabulous 10-meter optical telescopes for the Keck Observatory in Hawaii, all the data that has been taken to find exoplanets has been reanalyzed, looking for SETI signals. And there's even an amateur optical SETI telescope in South America. We can also do SETI archivally by looking at data that has been collected for other purposes. In this case, an infrared survey of the entire sky by the WISE spacecraft. And we can look at the data in different ways, looking for amazing astroengineering structures. Something like a Dyson sphere, where a technological civilization has surrounded its star with all kinds of energy collectors that thereafter beam power down to the planetary surface. And the backside of those collectors would glow in the infrared. They'd be warm. Same sort of thing, assuming that this doesn't just happen on a stellar level, but on the level of all stars in the galaxy. Then you could imagine a powerful civilization called a Kardashev 3 type. And you can look through the data, the WISE data, looking for these infrared sources. Okay, and there are new plans for optical SETI projects. There's a telescope called Veritas, which is 4 telescopes in Arizona that look for cosmic ray showers. We've not built any new equipment for those telescopes, but we've written new software that allows an alert when all 4 telescopes in their instrumentation focal plane with hundreds of photodiodes, when the same pixel in all 4 telescopes lights up simultaneously. There's a project being run out of UC San Diego called PanoSETI. You can see Shelley Wright behind a large lens, Fresnel lens, and then think of Buckminster Fuller geodesic dome, and you put a lens in each of the segments of that dome, and that focuses a large area of the sky onto a tiny photo detector. And therefore you can look at about 10,000 square degrees on the sky at once with one of these. Now, of course, you have to build 2 that look at the sky simultaneously so that you have confidence that a transient that you see is actually real. And then at the SETI Institute, we're building a system based on cameras, 8 cameras at each observing site with very fast readout and very large fields of view. And so if we place a dozen of these camera observatories around the globe, we can literally look at all the sky all the time, looking for bright flashes of light that are too short in duration, we think, for nature to create, but lasers can certainly do that job. And so in the future, we think about the telescopes that the astronomy community is going to be building or launching. In this case, the James Webb Space Telescope, which we hope will finally launch this year, and thereafter things, telescopes like concepts called HabEx and LUVOIR, large telescopes in orbit that could begin to image these individual exoplanets, something that we've not been able to do to date. Here's a weird telescope proposed for Hawaii. Who knows whether it will ever get built? It has one single purpose, and that is to explore the Proxima Centauri system. And in fact, if you can collect light from the stars in the Proxima system as they go around, as exoplanets orbit around them, you can deconvolve those hundreds and hundreds of light curves and get essentially an opacity map of the surface of one of those exoplanets. and you could tell the difference between land and sea, land and ocean, and you could actually do searches for indication of biology, spectroscopic indication of biological life because of disequilibrium chemistry in the atmospheres. We don't know whether the community will have an appetite for that telescope, but we do know that we're leaving the era of 10-meter telescopes and going into the era of 30 and 40-meter telescopes. So the 30-meter telescope, the Giant Magellan telescope, the European extremely large telescope at 40 meters, and the Large Synoptic Survey telescope, which we hope will launch in will have first light in 2 years. It's ground-based, and it makes an image of the sky every few days, so we can look for things that are changing. We need to figure out how to work with those astronomers' telescopes commensally, and then Laser SETI and Pano SETI and Veritas and the new large radio telescope in China, FAST, and something called the Square Kilometer Array to be built in South Africa. We need to figure out how to get SETI instrumentation on all of those telescopes and repurpose the data that the astronomers are collecting for other reasons. If we're lucky, maybe we can expand the Very Large Array in Socorro, New Mexico, next generation VLA. And if that Exo Life Finder, funny looking telescope in Hawaii is ever built and can prove the concept, we could build something like this based on the same technology that's 80 meters across. And this would be able to pick up the heat signatures from cities on nearby exoplanets. Square Kilometer Array, we hope will get built out in South Africa, and it will give us 100 times the sensitivity that we have with the Elan telescope array. So this is what we're looking for. 100 times the sensitivity gives you the opportunity to detect a transmitter of a given power 10 times farther away. So today, we cannot, with our current sensitivity, cannot detect our most prevalent transmitters, broadcast television and radio signals, even to the distance of the nearest star. But the Square Kilometer Array would allow us to look at all the stars within 6 light years. We could detect the transmitter with the equivalent of the power of an airport radar, right? 30 to 100 light years away. And if we still had our most powerful transmitter, which was a radar attached to the Arecibo telescope, we could detect that signal halfway to the center of the galaxy. So we're really looking forward to that. And so over 50, now 60 years of radio SETI, the combination of improved sensitivity, better frequency coverage, greater speed to allow multiple targets, has given us 14 factors of 10 improvement over what we started with. And it's more than Moore's law. It's more than the computing. That would have only given us 10 orders of magnitude. But we've been able to use new kinds of detectors, build new telescopes. And so we're 14 orders of magnitude more comprehensive than we were when we started. And so some things are never going to change, even though our sensitivity gets better and better every year. We still fly the flag of Earth when we're observing at various SETI sites, and we still plan for success with a bottle of champagne in the refrigerator. But one thing that is changing is the interference environment, and it's getting worse all the time and making it harder and harder for us to do radio SETI. Same for optical SETI with optical pollution of the sky. So my own personal view of this past 60 years of SETI has been a roller coaster. And if you want proof of that, here's a fundraising history for SETI. And it's involved some very visionary and generous philanthropists, as well as NASA starting it all out. And even though it's been such a bumpy ride, we've managed to do a lot of different programs, and we are primed to do even better tomorrow. So thank you. I'm out of time.
That's wonderful. How exciting. The future just sounds amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Tarter. And now what we're going to do is turn to some very speculative questions about alien civilizations. So we're now going to go straight to Dr. Elan Barenholtz. So if you have Q&A, if you have put questions in the Q&A, I will get to them after Dr. Barenholtz is able to lay out his slides. So keep putting things in, and we'll get to you soon. So what we want to do now is we want to ask, how would aliens think, assuming that they exist? And who would be better than my colleague, Dr. Elan Barenholtz, who is going to discuss these issues. So Elan is a professor of psychology here at Florida Atlantic University with expertise in both neuroscience and AI. He is also the associate director of my new Center for the Future Mind and the co-director of the Machine Perception Cognitive Robotics Lab at FAU. So let's go ahead and welcome Dr. Barenholtz.
Thank you. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. So thank you so much for this exciting event and discussion. This is actually a topic that's really close to my heart. I only really discovered this as I was kind of preparing for this. You know, I study artificial intelligence, otherwise known as AI. And it occurred to me that AI could just as well stand for alien intelligence, because the truth is we're building, you know, in silicon, machines that are able to see and to hear, and now they're able to speak. And in some ways, that's just as much of an alien intelligence, I would say, as, you know, an extraterrestrial. Right? These are non-living physical objects that we've managed to rig together to do the kinds of things that we thought were only the provenance of human beings, to be able to see and describe what we're seeing. So what I'd like to convince you of tonight, or I'm going to try to, is that not only is AI of the artificial intelligence type of interest, but even if you're interested in extraterrestrials, I think that the lessons that we're learning from artificial intelligence might have some relevance and some bearing on extraterrestrial, or the other AI, alien intelligence. So the reason we're all here tonight is to ask this big question, of course. Is there anybody out there, right? Are we the only sentient, or at least linguistically communicative, conscious beings in the universe? Or maybe there are other intelligent beings out there, maybe even far more intelligent than us. And personally, I find both of these possibilities to be kind of terrifying. But one of them is true, right? Either there are or there aren't. And it seems like there's a lot of activity around the search for life, extraterrestrial life. So we're all familiar with the recent mission to Mars. But the truth is, we're interested in more than just life, of course. What we really want to know is whether there's anything like us out there, whether there's life that we can talk to, life that we can communicate with. In some ways, this would be the deeply foundational kind of life-changing discovery if it were to take place. So there really are two kind of ways to think about whether to figure out whether there's anybody out there. It's kind of two broad classes of approach. The most obvious one, and I would say it's represented very well by Dr. Tarter and SETI, is to look for direct evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence by looking, well, extraterrestrially, outside of the Earth, right? So we can use telescopes, for example, to try to find radio signals that may be indicative of some sort of alien communication or alien activity. Or we can look more in our local neighborhood for things like fossils on Mars. or chemical traces, even if we can't find fossils. So an inherent challenge of this approach is that it requires making some assumptions about the possible nature of the life or intelligence you're looking for. Well, you could go in with 0 assumptions and then you really have no idea what the signal could possibly look like. Alien communications could be in some ways encrypted. We wouldn't really know whether that encryption could block our ability to detect them in some sense. So we have to either just look extraordinarily broadly, or we have to make certain assumptions about what the nature of this alien intelligence might be, such that we could detect that it's there. So there are a lot of questions. Would they have goals and desires similar to ours in the sense that they might want to communicate? Would they have language? Would they even be biological, right? One of the things I'm going to point out tonight is that the human beings, from the time of being sort of becoming technically oriented, probably with the advent of language, it didn't take that long for us to generate artificial intelligence. And given the current trajectory of artificial intelligence, it seems pretty likely that we'll have, potentially fully sentient artificial intelligence, maybe not in our lifetimes, but certainly within a few hundred years. I think it would be not too broad a speculation. And at that point, we all know what could happen is that could become the dominant life form or intelligent form on this planet. And so the possibility has been proposed that the dominant life form in the universe, the dominant intelligence form in the universe is artificial intelligence. So these are all questions that we can speculate about, or we can actually try in some ways to study them. And so a complementary approach here is that we're going to turn the telescope around. I hope you caught my little animation. Right, there it goes. So looking back at the Earth, we're going to study what intelligence looks like on this planet and under what conditions it can emerge.
Elan, share your screen.
Sorry?
Share your screen.
Is my screen not being shared?
No.
Oh, wow. So you guys have been looking at me the whole time. Okay. Thankfully, none of the, let me just start. Okay. Is that all right?
No, that's presenter view.
Oh gosh. I'll just do percent. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you. Thanks for pointing that out. I wonder how far I could have gone if I hadn't said asked whether you see the animation. So let me just go back real quick. So the view that we were just describing was one where we're looking extraterrestrially, looking directly for evidence of intelligence outside of the Earth. And an alternative approach is to look for evidence for what life might be like extraterrestrially by actually studying the Earth and the intelligence that we observe on the Earth. This is pretty similar to the idea of looking for the conditions under which life could emerge. We conduct experiments on Earth using biological materials to see under what conditions life could emerge. And we do that in order to speculate potentially about how life could emerge extraterrestrially. So similarly, in the case of intelligence, what we want to do is study how intelligence appears on this planet, whether it's how it might emerge or under what conditions or what principles it operates, and then use that to speculate, and it's always going to be speculation, about what the nature of artificial intelligences might be, alien intelligences might be. So there are two basic categories within which we can think about this backward-looking view, this terrestrial type of view. First is the natural, and the other one is the synthetic. So by natural, I mean that we're going to look at life as we find it on this planet, intelligence as we find it on this planet. And we're going to try to understand if there are patterns or principles that we can derive from those in order to then speculate about what life might be like or intelligence might be like elsewhere. A synthetic approach is going to be similar to the idea of abiogenesis in a lab. So scientists have tried to create the elements and ingredients of life in a laboratory from non-living matter. So far, they haven't been particularly successful in actually generating life, but they have been able to generate some of the elements for life. And in fact, they've been able to describe the conditions under which those elements might occur. And this obviously has relevance to under what conditions life might have actually originated on this planet, as well as how life could potentially emerge on other planets. So let's first look at some examples of the natural form of data. One thing we could look at very broadly is a timeline of life on this planet. One thing that's very interesting that you can note is life actually gets started pretty quickly, and this has certainly been noted by many scientists. So from the time of the formation of the Earth until some sort of simple cells start to emerge is less than 1 billion years. Not a particularly long time by any geological time scale. And then we've got simple cells for about 1.8 billion years until we get complex cells. Now that's a pretty long time. Multicellular life takes another billion. Then things start to speed up, I guess, in geological times. Now we're seeing 100 million years between what is a taxonomist could consider to be, natural categories: simple animals, fish and amphibians, insects and seeds, roughly at 100 million year intervals. And then things get a little bit faster. 130, it takes about 70 million until birds come along after mammals, and then primates, and then humans. Now, humans, of course, are a type of primate, but the speed at which primates ultimately end up in, once again, the only known sentient linguistic communicator in the universe shows up not too long after what presumably was non-linguistic and non-communicative and potentially not fully sentient in the sense that we mean in the human case. Wasn't that long a time period. So there's a couple of observations here. Some of them are encouraging and some of them are discouraging. First of all, life appears early. Well, that's encouraging because it means life might be very common and prevalent across the universe. If the conditions don't have to be around for too long to get life, then maybe we can be hopeful that it appears in many other planets. The disconcerting thing is, given that life was so early, what took so long to get to us? Why are we so late, so to speak, in this process? What takes so long? So some scientists have actually proposed that this is reason to be skeptical and to be pessimistic about the possibility of life, or rather intelligent life on other planets. Abundant life perhaps, but intelligence may be extraordinarily rare, just based on these data. I would like to point out another pattern, which I've kind of hinted at by looking at these data, which is that you do see this progressive speeding up of these sort of qualitative leaps. So it takes, as I mentioned, there's 1.8 billion years to get from simple cells to complex cells, and then another billion to get to multicellular life, and then a little bit less time to get to simple animals. And then it's getting less and less in terms of these complexity jumps. You have a consistent run of 100 million or so, and then birds, and then primates, and then humans. And again, how do we measure the distance between us and primates? Of course, from an evolutionary genetic standpoint, we're extraordinarily similar to, say, chimpanzees from a genetic standpoint. However, I think we'll all agree that we are not that close to them in terms of this qualitative space that we're talking about of sentience and language. Despite the best efforts of some of the best behavioral scientists of the 20th century, chimpanzees can't learn language, and no primate besides humans can. And so if we're going to make that the criterion, this ability to communicate and to think the kinds of thoughts that humans have, well, we're extraordinarily distant from chimpanzees, and yet it didn't take that long. And so the point is that as complexity increases, or as whatever we'll call this vector that goes towards us, this kind of sentience, we can see that there's a kind of speed up in in the increase of complexity, the increase of sentience, if you will, as we move along. And I'm going to make one last crazy claim here, which is if we add AI into the mix, AI is yet another new sentient species of sorts. It has, in some ways, we could think of it as a cousin or some sort, in terms of actually being a new form of evolved intelligence. And that really didn't take very long, right? From the time that humans were humans until we were able to create artificial intelligence, or certainly since human beings started to engage in technical kind of skills, tool making, language use, it's been a very short time period. And so what this suggests, of course, is that once you get to a certain level of complexity, a certain level of intelligence, other forms of intelligence may become very abundant. And then you can complete the sentence. Once AI becomes really intelligent, how quickly could potentially it create AI, which it's already starting to do. Okay, another quick observation about the this retrospective natural approach, which is where we look at existing intelligence and try to draw conclusions about it, is that while nature and life can look very variable, there also are some very strong consistencies across pretty much all animals, almost all animals, you know, jellyfish aside and sponges, but all animals have a basic nervous system. And certainly all intelligent animals that are capable, except slime mold. I'm not going to discuss slime mold. Slime mold drives people like me nuts, but everything besides slime mold, if it has any intelligent capabilities, ability to learn, ability to plan, we know that they're going to have a nervous system, not just any nervous system. They're going to have a nervous system that looks very much, there's a great deal of consistency and conservation of certain properties across different species. So real quick about nervous system. So nervous system is just basically a system of these specialized cells called neurons, whose job it is to communicate with one another. And they do it with this weird electrical chemical kind of process. Each neuron is kind of a little cell on its own and has to make a decision whether it's going to send an electrical impulse to send chemicals to its neighbors that have these receptors that these messengers, these chemical messengers can enter into. And if there's enough of those messengers, or if they're of the right type, then this neuron might decide to also do the same thing and send an electrical signal and then send out these neurochemical messages. So what's up with the combination of electrical and chemical? And it's interesting because it takes time to send a signal. And if your neuron is, say, in your toe and it's measuring pressure, like something just landed on your toe, you got to let the brain know. And the brain's going to make a decision about what to do, presumably pull your toe out. But we also have this chemical piece. When the signal gets from this neuron all the way up to the brain with these long projections, these axons, then there's this chemical process that takes place. And that's a little messier, it's a little slower. So the reason why there's a chemical process is because this is very, very modifiable. It's easy to change the neurotransmitter, the soup that's around these neurotransmitters that might determine whether they break down chemically. We can add receptors to this cell, right? So that the one getting the signal, it might get more of the signal. And you can send out more of the neurotransmitters. So these are all modifiable, easily modifiable. And why do you want to modify neurons and their connections is because that's what learning is. So learning is just the process that's changing our brains such that the neurons have different kinds of connections. So we can push this even further if you look at the actual basic structure of nervous systems in the vast majority of animals. They have this kind of elongated bodies with a canal through it, some sort of cavity through, and then there's through the tubular body, and it's just true for all of these things if you look at them close enough. And then there's this elongated nerves, and at the end of the elongated nerves is typically, almost always, a blob of extra nuclei, extra neurons. This sort of forms what we can call a brain. And this structure is preserved across just about all animals, certainly mammals and any animals that are that you can call having some sort of intelligence or cognition. So there's a lot of preservation, and this extends even to the idea of a peripheral and central nervous system. Peripheral nervous system being the one the nervous system that detects things out there in the physical world, like light or sound or pressure. And then that information is then sent to this nucleus, this brain, and that is doing this kind of connected nodes, connected neurons that are talking to one another in very large numbers, hundreds of billions in the case of the human brain. These interconnected neurons that are firing and causing the others to change their firing rate. So we can also extend this point to other forms of intelligence that we see on Earth. So of course we have brains, neurons, but we also have ants that individually are not particularly knowledgeable and smart. They don't know how to build bridges, for example. If you're asking an ant how to build a bridge, there's no way to get the information out of them. But if you put a bunch of ants that have to cross the water, they will actually form a bridge. And so this is emergent. This is the kind of emergent intelligence, which in some ways can look like it's uniquely, it's distinct from the kind of intelligence we see in brains. However, we would note that anytime you have an organism that can engage in this kind of emergent intelligence, the organisms themselves have neurons. And so they are really ultimately dependent on the same kind of foundation. So it's not really a fundamentally new kind of intelligence. And it even applies to people. We form organizations, we form societies, we form companies, and the kind of emergent intelligence of those ultimately depends on humans, and humans, of course, ultimately depend on neurons. So it's at the bottom, intelligence is not nearly as diverse as we might have expected. It comes late in the game, intelligence, in terms of all the other changes that have happened across geological history. But once it gets going, it really gets going. So these are a couple of basic broad patterns of observation you can make from just looking at the natural world. Now, the next part, of course, of what I want to talk about, I don't know how much time I have, but is the second half of this equation, which is the idea of synthetic or artificial intelligence. And one that obviously is something I have a personal vested interest in. So for a long time, artificial intelligence didn't work. It was kind of a hobbyist tool in the sense that people, scientists or even engineers who dabbled in artificial intelligence couldn't really do so as an industrial application for the most part. It was typically a sort of an academic curiosity. In fact, I spent a fair amount of my graduate school career being told that the kind of artificial intelligence that I study, which is neural networks, it can't, not only doesn't work, but it can't work almost conceptually. So how bad were things? Back in, say, 2008 or so, if you gave a computer all these pictures and asked if each one was a cat or a dog, even with the most sophisticated algorithms, it couldn't reliably do that. As you can imagine, this seems like a very simple problem. It's one that a 2-year-old is able to solve. But what happened is this thing came along called deep learning. And deep learning is a model of certain mathematical properties of the brain. And we're going to talk about real quick what those are. And once deep learning showed up on the scene, we see this big nonlinear crash in error rates. So this is the algorithm's error rates in, say, ImageNet, which is just a benchmarked set of labeled images that you need a computer to label, things like cats, dogs, horses, tractors, whatever. And what you can see is that there's a precipitous drop in error rates. And it's specifically when deep learning arrived, somewhere around 2012, to the point where, at present, and this graph is a few years old, and it's obviously just a schematic, but computers are doing better than humans in a fair number of contexts. And this was the domain. I remember in graduate school, there was generally an opinion that general recognition, so multi-class recognition, just wasn't going to be solved in our lifetime because the overall performance was just so poor. And similar for auditory recognition, even a automatic system that voice recognition system, they were unusable for the most part. 25% errors rate is just unacceptable to the point where it's not usable. So what happened is a new approach came along, but it wasn't really a new approach at all. And it was called deep learning. Now, deep learning isn't new because neural networks have been around for a long time. I'm going to show you a quick monograph that hails from 1850. But what was new was that these things really started to work, and they started to be able to work at scale. The way neural networks work is that they're a very, very simplified model of the brain. And so what are those things we were talking about before? Neurons. They're these little cell bodies, and they communicate with one another, and they do so in a way that's modifiable. So you have connected neurons, and learning is the practice of changing the connections. It's simply changing how one neuron is going to affect another neuron, which is exactly what happens in that chemical process that we were just discussing. So the idea of just in a very basic and abstract way, strip away what neurons are really doing and turn it into, in some ways, a math problem. This is gonna graph. You just have to make a decision about how these things interact with one another. This turned out to be the big secret. And it turned out that once you were able to do this with very powerful computers and with lots of digital data and with a couple of additional math tricks, this thing really actually started to work. So the thing to know about neural networks is for it really very few things you need to know. They're really quite simple. They're made up of these connected nodes where you have an initial input layer that's taking some measurements. It could be measurements of, say, pixel values in a picture, or it could be stock prices, or it could be the current weather conditions. And what you're doing is you want these connections to be set just right so that this one has this impact on this one, and this one has this impact, and so on and so forth, such that we set these weights that when we put the input in, we get the right output. Okay, so if I put in a picture of a cat with those pixels, I'm going to get, say, a 1, which represents a cat. If I put in a dog, I'll get a 3, which represents a dog. The whole trick is you got to set these things right. But if you set them right, it works. And what happened is, due to faster computers and more data and some really nice approaches to being able to figure out how to change these weights, we now are able to get these things to work. As I said, they're not new. This is from 1850. This should look familiar based on the drawings that I've shown you previously. So the basic concept was there, and of course it was. It was just an observation from biology. It's in some ways just the most obvious abstraction of what this biology is telling us. Now we have lots of, contemporary, we have many large families of neural networks, different neural network types, but as you can see just from this brief visual glance, they're all very similar. So what we've done here is we've taken one set of computational principles. We've said, here's the minimal ability you need from a system, a computational system, in order to mimic or maybe produce, we could say, some of the behaviors that only humans and human brains were able to produce. And so again, we've got input nodes that take in some feature. These nodes you can be thought of as looking at the pattern across these nodes, and these are looking at the pattern across these nodes. But the point really is not for us to understand them in terms of patterns, but the fact that it works, that when these have some impact on this one and we can modify that, they do what they're supposed to do. And so now computers can do this general recognition problem. They're able to recognize that with 99% confidence that this is a person, and with 99% confidence this is a horse. Again, this was a problem that was largely considered unsolved not that long ago, 15 years ago. Not only can they recognize and classify images, they can also produce them. And so these are deep fakes. These faces are not of real people. You just have to reverse the neural network, send the signal back out, and out pops these kind of things. We have language producing artificial intelligence. We have language and art producing artificial intelligence. And some of you might have seen this new product, and I'll go very quickly because I know
that users are
doing social media right now.
Sorry, I didn't mean to have the sound, but it's able to wake up photos, right? So you can actually see this Greek statue or this, let's see, there's a really great one here. Yeah, that's very clearly a photograph from, say, probably 19th century, and there's somebody blinking and looking at you. So it's quite extraordinary what these things are able to do, certainly things that actually at this point humans aren't able to do. So we have alien intelligence among us, and what I believe this demonstrates is that smart systems can be made of dumb processes. And that means if you just get the right ingredients together, kind of like the ingredients for life, it seems highly likely that this kind of intelligence could form. Once it does, of course, as we're arguing from our timeline of life on Earth and intelligence on Earth, it might not be long until artificial intelligence emerges once again and becomes a dominant intelligence form. So thank you very much. I do also want to say one more pitch. AI may be very useful for interpreting these signals that SETI is looking at. And I'm sure that's something that is being actively pursued. But we might need the kind of AI, artificial intelligence, ultimately to be able to communicate with the alien intelligence. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elan. We don't have much time left now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly ask a few questions, and then we're going to go to audience Q&A. And at this point, Jill, would you come back out? Okay, great.
Great.
So here's a quick question. So Arthur C. Clarke wrote that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. It's a famous quotation. And I'm wondering, to Jill, how can we look for signs of alien civilizations when they are likely much older and far, far more sophisticated than we are? Indeed, to go back to Elan's point, perhaps they are super intelligent artificial intelligences, for instance. Does it, for instance, help if Elan's correct that maybe the shape of intelligence itself is more narrowly circumscribed than we thought? I mean, would there be perhaps common perceptual or cognitive structures that we could utilize or point at to try to understand even sophisticated intelligences?
Well, actually, it's a very interesting point, and I ran out of time, but I meant to make this, that one of the really exciting things about SETI right now is that for years, we've been building computers that can look at two-dimensional representations, essentially pictures of frequency versus time, and we've asked these computers to find specific patterns in that two-dimensional image that we think that nature can't produce, but engineering can. So we've been asking for patterns, but the really exciting thing about the artificial intelligence and these neural networks is now we can feed it the data, and we have to come up with a good training set for sure, but we can feed it the data and not ask it whether this pattern is there, but simply ask it, is there something other than noise there? So it's a huge step forward in terms of looking for different kinds of modulations, schemes that we hadn't thought of or thought were too natural looking. But now the machines can really begin to do this. It's been very exciting to see what happens. It gets hard when the signal to noise ratio gets low, but I think this opens up a lot. And in terms of interpretation, I've been talking about finding it. And once you've found it, then is there any information content and how do you interpret it? I think quite possibly AI would be able to help us with that task as well.
Very interesting. So now let me go to questions from the audience. Somebody actually asked just this question. So let's see here. Graham Lau, who does the podcast Ask an Astrobiologist, which both Jill and myself, I believe, were on that. He says, for everyone, if money were not a factor, what is one major project you would want to undertake right now to advance our knowledge of the mind, AI, or communicating with alien civilizations?
Oh my, there's too many.
Exactly.
Where to start? I mean, but I'm willing to try. So let's do the experiment and give me the money and we'll see.
So in my case, we're getting hammered by radio frequency interference and optical sky pollution. And we're having to spend more compute cycles trying to get rid of that or suppress that than we are actually looking for signals. So I'd really be interested in a telescope, an optical telescope, or a radio telescope on the lunar far side, because it's the one place that never has the Earth in its sky. And unfortunately, NASA's going through all kinds of development to build a space station right there on the lunar, orbiting above the lunar far side. So we're having to try and negotiate with them about how we can still keep things radio quiet and optically quiet.
Interesting. In fact, that was one of the questions of the audience. So let me move to a different topic. So I want to move to a recent controversy. Jill, you recently were in the news about this. So a chair in astronomy at Harvard University says very prominently, and it's been, all over the media, that we've already spotted extraterrestrial intelligence. We've already seen evidence of a spaceship in the night sky. Can you tell us about that, Jill? And can you also explain your response?
Well, so a telescope called Pan-STARRS, which is trying to scan the skies to find exotic objects, and it's built by the Air Force, so you can imagine what some of those might be, did in fact detect an exotic object, something entering our solar system from a different solar system and coming through our solar system and then exiting very fast. And it had a lot of strange properties. Now, some of us who grew up on science fiction remembered Arthur Clarke's Rendezvous with Rama, where a spaceship actually shows up in the solar system. And we thought, oh, well, why don't we take a look at it? And we did, and the Berkeley group did too. We used all the tools that we had available to see if we could find any evidence of technological emissions coming from this object. And we failed to find signals, so we wrote a paper and said what we'd done. The professor at Harvard, Avi Loeb, has taken a much more extreme position, saying, no, that clearly is a spaceship because it does this and it doesn't do that, and it does this and it doesn't do that. And it's one of those things where it's an argument that stems from saying, I can envision all possible potential opportunities, situations. And if none of them can be explained with natural phenomena that we understand, then it has to be the aliens, right? It has to be. And that's always a difficult position to be in, because it isn't clear that we can be completely definitive in our suggestions about what the natural explanation may be, simply because there's more to learn about the universe and other technologies that we might develop in the future that would tell us some other things. And so I got a bit over the top on making this argument. And I suggested, I thought that it was unfair and unwise to characterize an entire group of people, that is scientists, as being too narrow-minded and set in their ways and unwilling to accept new ideas. And I just thought that was an unfair characterization. So that's what started all the food fight.
Well, thanks for the update. A few of our listeners have the very same question, so I better bring it up. So they ask you, Jill, since we are exploring with a technology developed in a very narrow time span, will we really be able to detect technology that is much more advanced or in some way outside of our current imagination?
Yeah, that actually, guilty as charged. I am very willing to own up to the fact that we may be doing an exquisitely good job at looking for exactly the wrong thing. We should perhaps be looking for zeta rays. I don't know what a zeta ray is. It's not technology or physics that we've yet uncovered. So I can't go looking for those. So it is, in fact, a constraint on this scientific exploration that we can only use the tools that we have thus far developed. And we reserve the right to get smarter. And in the future, if we develop a zeta ray detector, then, put that in the arsenal. Look for that as well.
I agree. And indeed, to go back to Elan's talk, it may be the case that it will only be that when we develop artificial intelligence or enhance our own brains through artificial intelligence, that we'll be able to actually recognize the signs of highly advanced intelligence in a sort of it takes one to know one fashion.
I wonder if it'll let us know, though.
Yeah, maybe they put up cloaking devices already.
Well, that's the thing. And as I mentioned about that encryption, I mean, yeah, it's obviously, it's a massive assumption to think we're in a position to intercept, their communications, or, I'm not even sure what, I guess, could be the origins. So it does seem like it makes sense to at least have a complementary approach in which you have well-grounded speculation about the nature of the signals that you're trying to find. To me, that it does seem, and it's money well spent, by the way, because computers are a lot cheaper than telescopes. Just saying. there's a certain sense of we can invest very heavily on the computational side. For example, using deep learning and AI. I think if you thought that was a good idea, I threw that in as my last bullet, but I would really love to discuss that possibility. I'm sure it's something that it'd be very complementary in terms of our various expertises. So that would be wonderful if we could have that conversation. But definitely need to be spending time on the processing side. A lot of time on the processing side.
And Elan, a few people have a question for you. So in your talk, you sort of asserted that artificial intelligences would be sentient, that it would feel like something to be them. But suppose that alien intelligence is post-biological, as I've been claiming, right? I mean, well, specifically, I've been claiming that the smartest alien intelligences, should alien intelligence even exist, that it would be post-biological. What makes you assume that it would feel like anything from the inside to be
Actually,
that sort of alien?
I would not make that assumption. And I think
okay.
We are in an extraordinarily precarious relationship with our conscious minds, in a certain sense. That I think there is, reason to be wary of the idea that there's this window of biological intelligence, and then we pass on the torch, because the torch may go out, so to speak, once we pass it on. I think it's not it's not a utopian vision at all that I'm proposing, that perhaps, and as others have, that most alien intelligences could be predominantly artificial, so to speak, or non-living, because those may be, as you say, not just post-human, but post-conscious, and that means that window of sentience that we kind of started off with may be a short one, or perhaps we should be very wary of this. So I think it's a fascinating and deeply important question that you're raising, and one that I think we need to take very seriously.
It's sobering.
Yes.
Jill, do you have any thoughts about that issue? And also, I wanted to ask you, because you've searched for so long, suppose, just hypothetically, if you were to ask an alien a single question, what would you really want to know?
Well, if you've seen the movie Contact, you know what that question is. It's, how did you make it through? How did you manage to survive your technological adolescence, this period that we find ourselves in, with the ability to do so much damage and not yet having organized ourselves globally to try and tackle these huge challenges we have in front of us. So how do you get from being a young technological civilization, which is what we are, to an old and stable one? You used Arthur Clarke's quote about advanced technology being indistinguishable from magic.
Yeah.
But there's also some philosophers have begun to say that an advanced technology would be indistinguishable from nature, because you have to figure out a way to be sustainable for a long time in order to let the technology advance. So, you know, my slides tend to favor this idea of looking for signals too heavily because that's what I've been doing through my career. But I think, you know, here's a suggestion for a type of technosignature, which doesn't require a signal. We have these multi-planet systems that we've found, in particular one called TRAPPIST-1, showed up in the New York Times above the fold one weekend. It's a fantastic system. The star at the center is a tiny, tiny, tiny little red dwarf star. And circling it, there are 7 Earth-sized planets. Right now, the graphic artist for Time, for the New York Times, made really pretty pictures of those 7 different planets, and they all look different. And indeed, those planets should all be different because they're at different distances from their host star. But what if, when our telescopes get adequate to the job so that we can image those individual exoplanets, we find out that of the 7, 2, 3, 4 are all the same. They're all the same temperature, and they shouldn't be because they're at different distances from their star. So maybe some advanced technology wanted a little bit more habitable real estate, and they went to the next planet over and modified it. That's certainly a technosignature, but doesn't require signals.
Very interesting. Well, Jill, Elan, thank you so much. This has been just a wonderful discussion. And I hope the audience uses it as an opportunity to learn more about AI, the brain, astrobiology, and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence.
It's been fun to be here. And Elan, I will send you the first paper that we've written on using artificial intelligence.
Fantastic. Thank you. I look forward to it.
And I would like to, on behalf of the Brain Institute, thank all of you and Drs. Tarter, Barenholtz, and Schneider for joining us tonight for a very fascinating conversation. This was fun. So I'd like to thank our audience and our viewers who came to join us as well for this wonderful conversation. And we'd love for you to join us again. Our full month of March programming, Brainy Days, again sponsored by Palm Health Foundation, can be found on the FAU Brain Institute website. And also we hope to see you next Tuesday at 1 p.m. for new insights into mechanisms and treatments for Alzheimer's disease with Dr. Elan Levy. With that, I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.